She collapsed onto the cracked vinyl seat of the 6 a.m. city bus, her designer suit wrinkled and her eyes hollow with exhaustion. The single father beside her didn't hesitate. When her head fell against his shoulder, he simply stayed still, letting this stranger rest while his young son slept in the seat across from them. Hours later, when she finally stirred awake, she whispered something that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his own life. This isn't just a story about a bus ride. It's about how one moment of human kindness can unravel years of carefully buried secrets and transform two broken lives in ways neither could have imagined. What started as a simple gesture between strangers would soon become a viral sensation that exposed a corporate conspiracy, reunited a fractured family, and proved that sometimes the people who need saving the most are the ones who look like they have it all together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through the thin walls of the Ashford Heights apartment at 5:15 a.m. sharp, just like it had every weekday for the past 3 years. Joseph Thompson Joe, to everyone who knew him, rolled out of the narrow twin bed that served as both his sleeping space and office chair, depending on the hour. The studio apartment was barely 400 square feet, but it was clean, organized, and most importantly, it was theirs. "Morning, buddy," Joe whispered, gently shaking the small shoulder poking out from beneath a superhero-themed comforter. "Time for our adventure." 7-year-old Danny Thompson stirred, his dark hair sticking up in every direction like he'd been struck by lightning in his sleep. "Do we have to go to Grandma Lucy's again?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes with tiny fists. "Just for a few hours before school," Joe said, smoothing down his son's unruly hair. "You know the drill. Daddy's got to work, and Mrs. Patterson across the hall isn't awake yet." The morning routine was choreographed with military precision, not because Joe had any military background, but because when you're a single father, working 2 jobs while finishing your accounting degree online, every minute counted. Cereal with sliced bananas, teeth brushed, backpack packed with homework and a worn copy of Captain Underpants, and out the door by 5:45 a.m. Joe Thompson hadn't planned on this life. 3 years ago, he'd been married to his college sweetheart, working as a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm in downtown Ashford Heights, living in a 2-bedroom house with a small yard where Danny could play. He'd been working toward his CPA certification, putting money aside for Danny's college fund, and planning family vacations they'd never quite saved enough to take. Then Sarah got sick. Cancer was a word that had entered their vocabulary like a tornado, sudden and devastating. The medical bills came first, then the missed work days, then the layoffs at the accounting firm during the recession. Sarah's life insurance helped with the funeral costs, but it couldn't cover the mountain of debt they'd accumulated fighting a battle they ultimately lost. Now, Joe worked the early shift at Brookfield Manufacturing, 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., operating machinery that stamped out automotive parts in a factory that smelled of oil and determination. After work, he'd pick up Danny, help with homework, make dinner. And then, after his son was asleep, he'd study for his online accounting courses until his eyes burned. On weekends, he worked at Peterson's hardware store, helping customers find the right screws and paint colors while Danny did homework in the break room, the city bus that took them from the Ashford Heights low-income housing complex to downtown. Was Joe's office his transition space, his moment to breathe? Danny would usually fall asleep against the window during the 45-minute ride, and Joe would review his notes or simply watch the city wake up through the scratched glass windows. Route 47 was a lifeline that connected the forgotten parts of Ashford Heights to the gleaming downtown district where people in expensive suits hurried to jobs that paid more in a month than Joe made in 6. The bus was always crowded with night shift workers heading home, early shift workers like himself, and the occasional businessman who'd missed his usual ride. Joe had learned to read the regular passengers like chapters in a familiar book. There was Maria, the hospital custodian who always sat in the third row and knitted scarves for her grandchildren. Behind her sat Bob, a security guard with calloused hands who shared his coffee with anyone who looked like they needed it. Near the back, Tommy, a construction worker, dozed with his hard hat in his lap, still covered in yesterday's dust. They were good people, working people, the kind who understood that kindness didn't cost anything and that sometimes a smile or a good morning could be the best part of someone's day. This particular Tuesday morning felt different, though Joe couldn't quite put his finger on why. Danny was more tired than usual, having stayed up late the night before working on a science project about the solar system. Joe had helped him create a model using painted tennis balls and coat hangers, and Danny's excitement about presenting it to his second-grade class had kept him chattering until nearly 10 p.m. "Dad," Danny said as they waited at the bus stop, his small hand tucked into Joe's larger one. "Mrs. Henderson says some kids don't have daddies who help them with projects." Joe's chest tightened. "Well, everyone's family is different, buddy. Some kids have daddies, some have mommies, some have both, some have grandparents or aunts and uncles. What matters is that they have people who love them." "I'm glad I have you," Danny said simply, leaning against Joe's leg. "I'm glad I have you too, son." The Route 47 bus wheezed to a stop, its doors opening with a hydraulic sigh. Joe helped Danny up the steep steps, nodding to Martin, the driver, who'd been working this route for 15 years and knew every passenger by name. "Morning, Joe, Danny," Martin said with a grin. "Ready for another day in paradise?" "Living the dream, Martin," Joe replied, fishing exact change from his pocket. They found their usual seats halfway back, close enough to the front for safety, far enough back to avoid the most crowded section. Danny immediately curled up against the window, using his backpack as a pillow. Joe opened his financial management textbook, though he found it hard to concentrate as the bus filled with its usual mix of early commuters. At the Riverside District stop, a woman in an expensive charcoal gray suit stumbled onto the bus. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and she moved with the careful deliberation of someone operating on pure willpower. She wore designer heels that looked like they'd been purchased for boardrooms, not public transportation, and she clutched a leather briefcase like it contained her entire world. The woman paid her fare with shaking hands, fumbling with bills that looked crisp and unfamiliar in her fingers. She scanned the crowded bus, her eyes hollow and desperate, looking for an empty seat that didn't exist. Joe glanced up from his textbook, meeting her gaze for just a moment. In that instant, he saw something he recognized, the exhausted desperation of someone who'd been running on empty for too long. Without thinking, he closed his book and gestured to the narrow space beside him. "There's room here," he said quietly. The woman looked at him with surprise, then gratitude, and collapsed into the seat with a shuddering exhale that sounded like she'd been holding her breath for days. What Joe didn't know was that this moment of simple kindness was about to unravel, a mystery that had been haunting him for 3 years, and change both their lives forever. Elizabeth Campbell had not slept in 47 hours. The woman who collapsed beside Joe Thompson on that Tuesday morning bus was a stranger to public transportation, a stranger to vulnerability, and increasingly, a stranger to herself. Just 18 months ago, her face had graced the cover of Business Weekly with the headline, "The Phoenix CEO: How Elizabeth Campbell Rebuilt Nexus Industries from the Ashes." Now those same magazines would probably run her obituary professional, if not literal. She tried to hold herself upright in the narrow bus seat, her spine rigid with the kind of posture that had been drilled into her through years of boardroom battles and hostile takeovers. But her body had other plans. The exhaustion was a living thing now, crawling through her veins like lead, making her eyelids feel like they weighed 1,000 pounds each. Joe noticed her struggle immediately. He'd seen that same desperate fight against collapse in the mirror. During those final weeks of Sarah's illness, when he'd refused to leave her bedside, even though the nurses kept telling him to go home and rest. Some battles, he'd learned, were fought one moment of staying upright at a time. Long night? He asked gently, closing his textbook and slipping it into the canvas bag at his feet. Elizabeth turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time. She saw calloused hands that spoke of real work, eyes that held kindness without judgment, and a face that seemed incapable of the corporate duplicity she'd been drowning in for months. When was the last time someone had asked her a simple human question without wanting something in return? Long year, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Joe nodded like he understood, which somehow impossibly made her feel like maybe he actually did. I'm Joe, he said, extending his hand. That's my son Danny by the window. He's perfected the art of sleeping anywhere. Anywhere. Elizabeth, she managed, shaking his hand with fingers that trembled slightly. His palm was warm and steady, everything hers wasn't. The bus lurched as it merged onto the highway that would take them into downtown Pinehurst, the city's financial district where glass towers scraped the sky and million-dollar decisions were made over overpriced coffee. Elizabeth had made that journey hundreds of times in the back of her company car, watching the world blur past from behind tinted windows. She'd never noticed how beautiful the sunrise looked from this angle, filtered through the scratched windows of public transit. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Are you okay? Joe asked when he noticed her hands shaking as she tried to hold her briefcase steady. The simple question broke something inside her. When was the last time someone had asked if she was okay and actually waited for an answer? When was the last time she'd been honest about the answer? I don't know, she admitted. I really don't know. Joe didn't push for more. In his experience, people shared what they needed to share when they were ready. Instead, he settled back in his seat and created what he'd learned was sometimes the most precious gift you could give someone, the space to simply exist without explanation. That small act of grace was Elizabeth's undoing. The exhaustion she'd been fighting finally won. Her head grew too heavy for her neck. Her shoulders sagged despite years of posture training. And slowly, inevitably, she began to lean. Joe felt the gentle pressure against his shoulder and made a choice that would change both their lives. He didn't move away. Instead, he adjusted his position slightly to make her more comfortable, careful not to wake her, and resumed his quiet watch over the morning commute. Danny continued sleeping against the window, his breath fogging the glass in small rhythmic puffs. The bus hummed its familiar tune of engine noise and conversation, but Joe found himself studying the woman who'd trusted him enough to let her guard down completely. Even in sleep, she looked haunted. Her brow was furrowed as if she were still fighting battles in her dreams, and occasionally she'd murmur something too soft to understand. Joe noticed things that her business associates probably never saw: a small scar on her left hand that looked old and deep, a medical alert bracelet peeking out from beneath her expensive watch, and most tellingly, a faded photograph tucked into the clear plastic sleeve of her briefcase. The photograph showed a much younger Elizabeth with a man and a small boy, all three of them laughing on what looked like a beach vacation. They looked happy, carefree, like a family that had never known tragedy. But something about the way Elizabeth clutched that briefcase even in sleep told Joe that whatever had happened to the people in that photograph was part of what had put those shadows under her eyes. As the bus wound through the increasingly familiar neighborhoods that led downtown, Joe found himself wondering what could have driven someone who clearly had money and success to this level of exhaustion. In his world, people were tired because they worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table. In her world, what battles were worth fighting to the point of collapse? Martin, the bus driver, caught Joe's eye in the rearview mirror and smiled, nodding toward Elizabeth. It wasn't unusual for Martin to see his passengers sharing space and kindness. The early morning route created its own community of people who understood that everyone was fighting something. 20 minutes from downtown, Elizabeth stirred. She lifted her head slowly, blinking in confusion as she realized where she was and what had happened. The mortification was instant and complete. "Oh God," she whispered, straightening up so quickly that Joe felt the absence of her weight like a cold wind. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to. I don't usually." "Hey," Joe said softly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used when Danny woke up from nightmares. "It's okay. Everyone needs to rest sometimes." Elizabeth looked at him with something that might have been wonder if it weren't so tinged with disbelief. "You don't understand. I don't do this. I don't fall asleep on strangers. I don't take public transportation. I don't." She gestured helplessly at herself, at the situation, at the inexplicable comfort she'd found in the shoulder of a man whose last name she didn't even know. "Sometimes life puts us where we need to be," Joe said simply, "even when we don't understand." "Why?" Elizabeth stared at him for a long moment, and Joe had the strange sensation that she was seeing something in his face that surprised her. Before she could respond, the bus began to slow as it approached the downtown terminal. "This is my stop," she said, gathering her briefcase and standing on unsteady legs. Joe stood as well, gently shaking Danny awake. "Come on, buddy, time to see Grandma Lucy." As Elizabeth moved toward the front of the bus, she turned back one more time. "Thank you," she said, and Joe could hear years of gratitude compressed into those two words. "Take care of yourself," he replied, meaning it more than she could possibly know. She stepped off the bus into the bustling morning crowd of downtown Pinehurst, her expensive heels clicking against the concrete as she disappeared into the maze of business suits and coffee shops. Joe watched her go, something nagging at the back of his mind, a sense of familiarity he couldn't quite place. What he didn't know was that Elizabeth Campbell was walking toward the Nexus Industries building, where in 3 hours she would face a board meeting that would determine not just her future, but the futures of thousands of employees whose livelihoods hung in the balance. And what she didn't know was that the man who'd given her the first peaceful sleep she'd had in weeks was about to become the most important person in a mystery that had been destroying her life one sleepless night at a time. Elizabeth Campbell's hands hadn't stopped shaking since she'd stepped off the bus. She stood in the marble lobby of the Nexus Industries headquarters, a 40-story glass monument to corporate ambition that pierced the Pinehurst skyline like a gleaming needle. The lobby buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Fortune 500 company executives in tailored suits checking their phones, assistants hurrying past with armloads of documents, and the constant ping of elevators delivering people to their carefully compartmentalized lives. 3 years ago, this had been her domain. She'd walked these halls with the confidence of someone who'd built something from nothing, who'd taken a failing manufacturing company and transformed it into one of the most profitable enterprises in the Pacific Northwest. Now, she felt like an imposter in her own building. "Miss Campbell." The voice belonged to Stanley Green, her executive assistant and one of the few people left who still treated her with something resembling respect. He approached with the carefully neutral expression he'd perfected over the past 6 months, ever since the board had started questioning every decision she made. "The board is assembled in conference room, and they're eager to begin." Elizabeth nodded, straightening her suit jacket and trying to summon the armor of authority she'd once worn so naturally. "How many?" "All 12 voting members," Stanley said quietly, "plus the attorneys." Elizabeth's stomach dropped. A full board meeting with legal counsel present meant they weren't just questioning her leadership anymore. They were preparing to remove her entirely. As they rode the elevator to the 38th floor, Elizabeth found herself thinking about the stranger on the bus, Joe. There had been something in his eyes, a steadiness that she hadn't encountered in months. When was the last time someone had looked at her without calculating what they could gain or lose by her presence? The conference room was exactly what she expected, a wall of expensive suits around a table that could seat 20, all eyes turning toward her as she entered. At the head of the table sat Harrison Blackwood, the chairman of the board and the man who'd been systematically undermining her authority since the incident 6 months ago. "Elizabeth," Harrison said with the kind of smile that never reached. "The eyes, thank you for joining us. Please sit." She took her place at the opposite end of the table, feeling like she was walking into her own execution. "Let's dispense with pleasantries," Harrison continued, opening a thick folder. "The quarterly reports show another decline in productivity. The Brookfield manufacturing acquisition has been a disaster, and there are still questions about the circumstances surrounding the Thompson account termination." Elizabeth's blood turned to ice at the mention of that name. Thompson. It had haunted her for 3 years, turning her dreams into nightmares and her successes into hollow victories. But hearing it now, just hours after meeting Joe Thompson on the bus, felt like the universe was playing some kind of cosmic joke. "I've explained the Thompson situation repeatedly," Elizabeth said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The decision to terminate the contract was made based on incomplete information. By the time we realized the error, it was too late too late to prevent the death of Sarah Thompson." Harrison's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Too late to acknowledge that our cost-cutting measures directly contributed to her inability to afford continued treatment?" The room fell silent. Elizabeth had relived this conversation 1,000 times, had written resignation letters she'd never sent, had stared at the ceiling through countless sleepless nights, knowing that her decision to cut healthcare benefits for contract employees had real faces, real consequences. Sarah Thompson had been more than just a name in a file. She'd been a young mother, the wife of one of their most reliable contract accountants, fighting cancer while trying to raise a small boy. When Nexus had terminated the healthcare benefits for all contract employees, as part of Elizabeth's aggressive cost-cutting strategy, Sarah's treatment had been interrupted. She died 6 weeks later. Elizabeth had found out too late. By the time the reports reached her desk showing the human cost of her corporate efficiency, Joseph Thompson had already been let go as part of the restructuring. The family had vanished into the vast machinery of economic hardship that her decisions had created. "I've taken full responsibility for that decision," Elizabeth said, each word feeling like it was being torn from her chest. "I've implemented new policies to ensure." "You've implemented policies that have cost this company millions in unnecessary overhead," interrupted Victoria Sterling, another board member whose loyalty had evaporated along with the quarterly profits. "Your guilt over one unfortunate situation has compromised your ability to make rational business decisions." "One unfortunate situation?" Elizabeth stood so abruptly that her chair rolled backward. "Sarah Thompson died because I prioritized profit margins over human lives. That's not guilt, that's accountability. Accountability that's destroying this company," Harrison said coldly. "Which brings us to why we're here today." He slid a document across the table toward her. Elizabeth didn't need to read it to know what it was, a vote of no confidence, probably drafted weeks ago and waiting for the right moment to destroy what remained of her career. "You have 24 hours to resign voluntarily," Harrison continued, "with a generous severance package and a non-disclosure agreement that protects both parties. Or we proceed with removal proceedings that will be less pleasant." Elizabeth stared at the document, her vision blurring with exhaustion and something that felt dangerously close to relief. Maybe it was time. Maybe she'd been fighting a battle she was meant to lose. But then she thought about Joe Thompson again. The kindness in his eyes. The way he'd let her rest without judgment or expectation. And suddenly, she realized something that made her blood run cold. Joe Thompson. Joseph Thompson. The timeline fit. The age fit. The bone-deep weariness of a man who'd lost everything and was rebuilding from nothing. "I need to make a phone call," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Elizabeth," Harrison's voice carried a warning. "Your time for delays and excuses has 24 hours, she interrupted, backing toward the door. "You said I have 24 hours. She was out of the conference room before anyone could respond, Stanley's concerned voice calling after her as she stabbed the elevator button with trembling fingers. In the elevator, alone for the first time in hours, Elizabeth pulled out her phone and did something she'd never thought she'd have the courage to do. She opened her contacts and scrolled to a number she'd memorized but never called. Dr. Patricia Rowe, the oncologist who'd been treating Sarah Thompson. The doctor who'd tried to reach Nexus Industries multiple times to explain that the interrupted treatment could be fatal. The doctor whose calls Elizabeth had been too busy to return. "Dr. Rowe," came the familiar voice after 2 rings. "This is Elizabeth Campbell from Nexus Industries," she said, her voice shaking. "I need to ask you about Joseph Thompson. Does he have a son named Danny?" There was a long pause. "Ms. Campbell, I'm not sure why you're asking, but yes. Danny Thompson is 7 years old. He and his father they've been struggling since Sarah's death." "Why?" Elizabeth closed her eyes, leaning against the elevator wall as the pieces of an impossible puzzle fell into place. "Because I think I just met him. And I think the universe is giving me a chance to fix the worst mistake I've ever made." What Elizabeth didn't know was that at that very moment, Joe Thompson was sitting in the break room at Brookfield Manufacturing, staring at a letter that had arrived in his employee mailbox that morning. A letter from Nexus Industries, marked Urgent, Settlement Offer. That would explain everything about the woman who'd fallen asleep on his shoulder and change both their lives forever. Joe Thompson's hands were steady as they'd been every day for the past 3 years, guiding sheets of metal through the industrial press that shaped automotive parts with precise, thunderous blows. The rhythm of the machinery had become his meditation, a mechanical heartbeat that drowned out the quieter ache that never quite left his chest. Brookfield Manufacturing wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. The factory floor smelled of oil and hot metal, and the noise required everyone to communicate in hand signals and shouted phrases. Joe had learned to find peace in the predictability of it all. Clock in at 6 a.m., operate press station 7 until 2 p.m., collect his paycheck every Friday, and pretend that this was enough. During his lunch break, he sat in the small employee break room with its flickering fluorescent lights and vending machine that ate dollar bills more often than it dispensed snacks. The other workers gave him space, not out of dislike, but because they recognized grief when they saw it. Joe Thompson was a good man who'd been dealt a bad hand, and everyone at Brookfield knew better than to pry into wounds that were still healing. He was unwrapping a peanut butter sandwich, Danny's favorite, so Joe ate them too out of solidarity when Supervisor Williams approached with a manila envelope. "Thompson," Williams called over the industrial humming that never quite stopped, even during breaks. "This came for you in the employee mail, marked Urgent." Joe took the envelope, noting immediately that it wasn't the usual bills or promotional flyers that occasionally found their way to the factory. The return address made his blood run cold. Nexus Industries Legal Department, Pinehurst Financial District. His hands, so steady on the machinery, began to tremble. Nexus Industries, the company that had terminated his contract 3 years ago with 6 hours' notice. The company whose restructuring had eliminated his health insurance just when Sarah needed it most. The company he'd called 17 times, begging anyone to explain why his wife's cancer treatment had to stop because of a policy change. Joe had spent months trying to reach someone at Nexus who could help, who could explain, who could show just 1 ounce of human compassion. He'd been transferred between departments, put on hold for hours, and eventually told that all contract employees were being terminated due to economic optimization. No exceptions. No appeals. No consideration for the fact that Sarah was in the middle of chemotherapy. He'd never gotten past the receptionist. Never spoken to anyone with actual authority. Never received so much as an acknowledgement that his family's crisis mattered to the people who'd caused it. Now, 3 years later, they were reaching out to him. Joe's co-workers had noticed his stillness. Big Eddie, who operated the press next to his, set down his coffee and moved closer. "You okay, Thompson? You look like you've seen a ghost." Joe stared at the envelope for a long moment, then carefully opened it with fingers that felt disconnected from his body. Inside was a letter printed on expensive letterhead, the kind of formal business correspondence that made lawyers rich and regular people nervous. "Dear Mr. Thompson, Nexus Industries has recently completed an internal audit of employment terminations conducted between 2019 and 2022. During this review, we identified several cases where proper procedures may not have been followed, including the termination of your contract in March 2021. We understand that the timing of your termination created significant personal hardship, particularly regarding health insurance coverage for your family. While Nexus Industries maintains that all terminations were conducted within legal parameters, we recognize that our communication could have been more compassionate and thorough. As part of our commitment to making amends for any oversights, we would like to offer you a settlement package that includes back pay for the remainder of your original contract period, compensation for lost health insurance benefits, a formal letter of recommendation, priority consideration for any current openings that match your qualifications. We would very much like to discuss this matter with you in person. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to schedule a meeting. Sincerely, Elizabeth Campbell, Chief Executive Officer, Nexus Industries." The letter fluttered to the table as Joe's hands went limp. Elizabeth Campbell. The name hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly he was back on the bus that morning, watching an exhausted woman in an expensive suit collapse into the seat beside him. Elizabeth Campbell, the CEO of Nexus Industries, had fallen asleep on his shoulder. Big Eddie picked up the letter, his eyes scanning it quickly. "Holy hell, Thompson, what's this about?" Joe couldn't speak. His mind was racing through the impossible coincidence, trying to make sense of a universe that would put him face to face with the person responsible for Sarah's death without either of them knowing it. "Joe?" Eddie's voice seemed to come from far away. "Talk to me, man. What's going on?" "The woman on the bus this morning," Joe whispered, his voice barely audible over the factory noise. "I let her sleep on my shoulder. I was kind to her." Eddie looked confused. "What woman? What are you talking about?" Joe stood abruptly, the letter still clutched in his hand. "I have to go. Tell Williams I'm sick. Tell him I'll be back tomorrow." He was halfway to the parking lot before Eddie could respond, his work boots echoing against the concrete as he tried to process what felt like the cruelest joke the universe had ever played. Meanwhile, across town in her corner office on the 38th floor of the Nexus Industries building, Elizabeth Campbell was staring out at the city skyline and wondering if she'd finally lost her mind completely. Dr. Patricia Rowe had confirmed her suspicions. Joseph Thompson, age 32, widowed father of one son, former contract accountant. The man whose wife had died while Elizabeth was too busy cutting costs to return phone calls from desperate oncologists. The man who'd given her the first peaceful rest she'd had in months without knowing who she was. Stanley Green knocked softly on her office door. "Miss Campbell? The board is asking about your decision regarding the resignation letter." Elizabeth turned from the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Stanley, do you believe in divine intervention?" Her assistant blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry?" "The letter we sent to Joseph Thompson about the settlement offer. Has he responded?" Stanley checked his tablet. "Not yet, but it was just delivered this morning." These things usually take a few days for people to process. Elizabeth nodded slowly. When he calls, and he will call, I want to handle it personally. Not the legal department, not HR, me. Miss Campbell, that's highly irregular. Legal protocols suggest— Stanley, Elizabeth interrupted, her voice carrying a strange new certainty. Some things are more important than protocols. When Joseph Thompson calls, put him through to me immediately. As if summoned by her words, the phone on Stanley's desk began to ring. He glanced at the caller ID, then looked up at Elizabeth with wide eyes. It's him, Stanley whispered. Joseph Thompson is on line 1. Elizabeth stared at the phone for a moment that felt like an eternity. On the other end of that line was the man who'd shown her kindness when she needed it most, not knowing that she was the architect of his greatest tragedy. Put him through, she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. The next conversation would either destroy them both or begin the most unlikely redemption story either of them could have imagined. The phone rang 3 times before Joe Thompson found the courage to speak. He sat in his aging Honda Civic in the Brookfield Manufacturing parking lot. The settlement letter spread across his steering wheel like evidence in a trial he'd never asked to participate in. Through the windshield, he could see his coworkers heading back from their lunch break, returning to their stations where the work was hard, but the expectations were clear, simple, honest. Elizabeth Campbell speaking. Her voice was different. On the phone smaller somehow, stripped of the corporate authority he'd expected. It was the same voice that had whispered, "Thank you" on the bus that morning, tired and human and real. "This is Joseph Thompson," he said, his own voice steadier than he felt. "I received your letter." There was a pause so long that Joe wondered if the call had been disconnected. Then, quietly, "Joe, from the bus this morning." It wasn't a question. She knew, somehow impossibly, she'd figured out that the man who'd let her rest on his shoulder was the same man whose life her company had destroyed. "You're Elizabeth Campbell," Joe said. "CEO of Nexus Industries." "Yes," the word came out like a confession. "And you fell asleep on my shoulder this morning." "Yes." Joe leaned back in his driver's seat, staring up at the fabric ceiling of his car where a small stain marked the spot where Danny had once spilled chocolate milk during a weekend trip to the park. Back when weekend trips to the park were possible. Back when Sarah was alive to laugh at their son's clumsiness and kiss the worry lines from Joe's forehead. "Why now?" he asked. "Why after 3 years are you suddenly interested in making amends?" Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper. "Because I've been carrying the weight of what happened to your family for 3 years. And this morning I discovered that the universe has a sense of irony I'm not sure I can survive." "The weight?" Joe's voice hardened. "You've been carrying the weight?" "Joe, do you know what weight feels like, Ms. Campbell?" Joe's composure cracked, 3 years of buried anger spilling out like water through a broken dam. "Weight is holding your wife's hand while she apologizes for dying because the cancer treatment stopped and she thinks it's her fault for being too expensive to save. Weight is explaining to a 4-year-old boy why mommy isn't coming home from the hospital. Weight is working 2 jobs while studying for an accounting degree online because your family's medical debt means you'll never dig out of poverty." Elizabeth's silence stretched between them, and Joe could hear something that sounded like crying. "Weight," Joe continued, his voice breaking now, "is carrying your son to bed every night and knowing that no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you sacrifice, you'll never be able to give him the life his mother dreamed of for him." "I know," Elizabeth whispered. "I know, and I'm so sorry, Joe. I'm so incredibly sorry. Sorry doesn't bring her back." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "It doesn't, but maybe there are other things we can bring back." Joe wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, feeling suddenly exhausted. "What does that mean?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, not the polished tone of a CEO, but the raw honesty of someone who'd run out of pretenses. It means that I've been destroying my own life, trying to figure out how to undo what I did to yours. It means that for 3 years, I've been implementing policies that my board calls financially irresponsible because I can't stop seeing Sarah's face in every decision I make. It means that tomorrow I'm probably going to lose my job because I care more about preventing another Thompson family tragedy than I do about quarterly profits. Joe sat up straighter. You're losing your job? The board is forcing me to resign. They think my guilt over what happened to your family has compromised my ability to make rational business decisions. Elizabeth laughed, but there was no humor in it. They're probably right. I haven't slept more than 2 hours at a time since I found out what our policy changes cost your family. I've been taking the bus to work for weeks because I can't bear to sit in the back of a company car while my driver makes small talk about the weather, knowing that car costs more than most people make in a year. That's why you were on the bus, Joe said, understanding beginning to dawn. That's why I was on the bus. That's why I haven't been home to my penthouse apartment in days. That's why I fell asleep on your shoulder, because for the first time in months, someone offered me kindness without knowing who I was or what I'd done. Joe stared out at the factory where he'd rebuilt his life one shift at a time. You said there were things we could bring back. What did you mean? I meant your career, Joe. You were a brilliant accountant. Your supervisor at the time, before the termination, called you one of the most naturally gifted financial analysts he'd ever worked with. You were 3 credits away from your CPA certification when everything fell apart. Joe's throat tightened. I couldn't afford to finish. Between work and Danny and trying to keep our heads above water, ... What if you could? What if finishing your degree wasn't just possible, but guaranteed? What if you could work in a field that actually used your talents instead of just your time? Miss Campbell, Elizabeth, please. After this morning, I think we're past formalities. Joe took a deep breath. Elizabeth, I appreciate the settlement offer, I really do. But I'm not looking for charity. I'm not looking to be your redemption project. It's not charity, Elizabeth said firmly. It's justice. And it's not just about money, Joe. I've been fighting my board for months to change how we treat people. Not just contract employees, but everyone who gets caught in the machinery of corporate efficiency. I want to build something different. Something that sees people like your family as more than line items on a budget. What are you talking about? I'm talking about starting over. Both of us. I'm talking about building a company that operates on the principle that kindness isn't a luxury we can afford to cut from the budget. And I'm talking about doing it with someone who understands what it costs when we forget that every decision we make affects real families with real lives. Joe felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. It felt dangerously close to hope. You want me to work with you? I want you to help me build something that would make Sarah proud, Elizabeth said. Something that ensures no other family goes through what yours did. Something that proves business can be both profitable and humane. Joe closed his eyes, and for just a moment, he could almost hear Sarah's voice. She'd always believed in second chances, in the possibility that broken things could be made whole again. She'd believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. I need time to think, he said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need. But Joe? Yeah? Thank you for this morning. For giving me a place to rest when I needed it most. You have no idea how much that meant. Joe thought about the woman who'd collapsed beside him on the bus, exhausted and desperate and human. He thought about the kindness his mother had taught him, the same kindness Sarah had seen in him and loved him for. Everyone deserves a place to rest, he said. Even CEOs who make terrible mistakes. After he hung up, Joe sat in his car for a long time, watching clouds move across the sky and thinking about the strange mathematics of forgiveness. How much kindness did it take to balance a tragedy? How much grace was required to turn an ending into a beginning? He didn't have the answers yet, but for the first time in 3 years, he thought he might want to find out. What Joe didn't know was that their phone conversation was about to become the least private moment of his life, and that within 24 hours. The whole world would be talking about the single father and the CEO, who'd found each other on a city bus. Martin Reyes had been driving Route 47 for 15 years, and in that time, he'd learned that city buses were like confessionals on wheels. People said things, did things, and revealed parts of themselves they'd never share anywhere else. He'd seen marriage proposals and breakups, job interviews conducted over speakerphone, and more tears than he cared to count. But Tuesday morning's ride had been different. Special, even. Martin had been watching through his rearview mirror as the exhausted woman in the expensive suit had fallen asleep on Joe Thompson's shoulder. He'd seen a lot of kindness on his bus over the years, but there was something about the gentle way Joe had adjusted his position to make her more comfortable, the protective stillness he'd maintained for the entire ride, that had stuck with Martin long after his shift ended. That evening, Martin sat in his small apartment in the Riverside district, scrolling through social media while his wife Maria prepared dinner. She was a teacher at Pinehurst Elementary, and they had a tradition of sharing the day's small victories over homemade enchiladas and cheap wine. "Anything interesting happen on the route today?" Maria asked, setting down a steaming plate in front of him. Martin thought about Joe Thompson, about the woman who'd looked like she was carrying the weight of the world, about the simple human kindness he'd witnessed. You know what? Yeah, something did. Without really thinking about it, Martin pulled out his phone and opened the Transportation Authority's social media account. The Pinehurst Metro Transit System had started encouraging drivers to share positive stories about community connections, and Martin had been meaning to contribute for months. He typed slowly, hunting and pecking with 2 fingers. "Today I witnessed something beautiful on Route 47. A single dad let an exhausted stranger rest on his shoulder for the entire ride downtown. Didn't know her name, didn't ask for anything in return. Just human kindness when someone needed it most. These are the moments that restore your faith in people." #Root Kindness, #PINEHURST Community. Martin hesitated before posting. He'd been careful not to include names or identifying details, but something told him this story mattered. He hit post and returned to his dinner, not giving it another thought. What Martin didn't know was that social media had a way of finding the stories it needed, exactly when the world was ready to hear them. By Wednesday morning, the post had been shared 847 times. By noon, it had reached 15,000 shares. Local news outlets began reaching out to the Pinehurst Metro Transit System, asking for more details about the bus shoulder story that was suddenly trending across 3 states. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Campbell stood in her office, staring at her laptop screen with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Her assistant Stanley had brought the viral post to her attention after someone in the company's marketing department had forwarded it with a note. "Could this be our CEO?" Timeline and location match her unusual commute yesterday. "How many people have seen this?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely steady. Stanley winced. "The original post is approaching 50,000 shares. Local news picked it up, and ... He hesitated. "Channel 7 is calling it the Bus Angel story. They're asking for interviews." Elizabeth sank into her chair. In 18 hours, her private moment of vulnerability with Joe Thompson had become a citywide symbol of human kindness. The irony was suffocating. She was being celebrated for receiving compassion from the man whose life she'd destroyed. "There's more," Stanley said gently. "The board meeting has been moved up to this afternoon. Mr. Blackwood says the publicity is an unnecessary distraction during a critical transition period." Elizabeth knew corporate speak when she heard it. They wanted her gone before the story gained any more traction. Before anyone started asking questions about why the CEO of Nexus Industries was riding public transportation and falling asleep on strangers' shoulders across town, Joe Thompson was experiencing his own version of viral fame. 3 co-workers at Brookfield Manufacturing had seen the post and recognized the description. Big Eddie had shown Joe the story during their morning break, grinning with pride. "That's you, isn't it, Thompson? The bus angel?" Joe stared at the phone screen, reading comments from strangers praising his kindness. People were sharing their own stories of small acts of compassion, of times when someone had helped them through difficult moments. The thread had become a repository of human goodness, and somehow he was at the center of it. "I just let her sleep," Joe said, bewildered. "It wasn't anything special." "Maybe that's what makes it special," Eddie replied. "Most people would have moved away. You stayed." By lunch, Joe's phone was ringing constantly. Local radio stations wanted interviews. The Pinehurst Gazette wanted to feature him in their Community Heroes section. A morning talk show producer had somehow gotten his number and was offering to fly him to Los Angeles. Joe let every call go to voicemail. This wasn't who he was. He wasn't a hero or an angel or a symbol of anything. He was just a single father, trying to get through each day with his dignity intact, and now strangers were treating him like he'd performed some kind of miracle. But the call that changed everything came at 2:47 p.m., just as Joe was finishing his shift at Brookfield Manufacturing. "Mr. Thompson? This is Rebecca Chun from Channel 7 News. I'm working on a follow-up story about the bus incident, and I was hoping you might be willing to comment. I'm not really interested in. I understand you recently received a settlement offer from Nexus Industries regarding the death of your wife 3 years ago." Joe's blood turned ice. "How do you know about that?" "Public records, Mr. Thompson. Settlement offers of this magnitude require certain filings. What I find interesting is the timing. The offer was made just 1 day after the bus incident. Some might call that quite a coincidence." Joe's mind raced. How had a private settlement discussion become part of a news investigation? "I'm not going to comment on that. Mr. Thompson, are you aware that the woman who fell asleep on your shoulder was Elizabeth Campbell, CEO of Nexus Industries? The same company that terminated your healthcare benefits while your wife was receiving cancer treatment?" The phone slipped from Joe's hand, clattering to the factory floor. Around him, the industrial noise that had become his sanctuary suddenly felt deafening. Rebecca Chun's voice continued from the speaker. "We're running the story tonight at 11. If you'd like to provide your perspective, I'll be in the parking lot of Brookfield Manufacturing for the next hour." Joe bent to pick up his phone, his hands shaking as he ended the call. Through the factory windows, he could see a news van pulling into the parking lot. Its satellite dish extending toward the sky like an antenna searching for signals in the chaos. The simple act of kindness that had started on a Tuesday morning bus ride was about to become something much bigger, much more complicated, and much more dangerous than either Joe Thompson or Elizabeth Campbell could have imagined. What neither of them realized was that their story was about to expose not just their personal connection, but a web of corporate decisions that would shake Nexus Industries to its foundation and force an entire city to confront uncomfortable truths about the cost of business as usual. The bus ride that had brought them together was about to tear their carefully rebuilt lives apart. The Channel 7 news van in the Brookfield Manufacturing parking lot was just the beginning. By 6 p.m. Wednesday evening, Joe Thompson's modest apartment building in Ashford Heights looked like the site of a minor invasion. 3 news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward a sky that seemed suddenly full of eyes. Reporters with microphones and camera operators with equipment that cost more than Joe's annual salary clustered around the building's entrance, like moths drawn to a flame that could burn them all. Joe sat on his living room floor with Danny, helping his son with homework while trying to ignore the circus outside their window. They'd built a fort out of couch cushions and blankets, partly for fun, partly because it felt safer to be hidden from the world that had suddenly become very interested in their private lives. "Dad," Danny said, looking up from his math worksheet. "Why are all those people outside?" Joe's throat tightened. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that kindness had somehow become news? That the simple act of letting a tired stranger rest had opened doors he'd never meant to walk through? "Sometimes when people do nice things, other people want to hear about it," Joe said carefully. "But it doesn't change who we are or what's important." Danny nodded with the easy acceptance of youth, then returned to his subtraction problems. Joe envied his son's ability to find normal in the middle of chaos. The phone rang again, the 14th time in 2 hours. Joe had stopped answering after the 7th call, when a producer from a national morning show had offered him $5,000 just to appear on camera for 10 minutes. Money that could change their lives. Money that Danny would never have to worry about college funds or medical bills or any of the financial anxieties that kept Joe awake at night. But something about it felt wrong. Like profiting from grief. Like turning Sarah's memory into entertainment. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. This time, Joe recognized the number. It was Elizabeth. "Joe?" Her voice was strained, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. "Are you okay? I've been watching the news and, are you watching this?" Joe interrupted, gesturing toward the window where camera lights illuminated the parking lot like a movie set. "This isn't what I wanted. This isn't who I am." "I know," Elizabeth said softly. "I'm so sorry. I never imagined that Martin's post would." "It's not Martin's fault," Joe said, his voice sharper than he intended. "He was celebrating kindness. That's beautiful. But now they're turning it into something else. They're making us into symbols instead of people." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "There's something else, Joe. Something you need to know." After the story broke, my legal department started getting calls. Other people. Other families. Joe felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of calls? People who worked for Nexus as contract employees between 2019 and 2022. People who lost their health insurance during medical crises. People whose stories they sound exactly like yours. The phone slipped in Joe's sweaty palm. "How?" "Many people. 17 so far, and Joe. Some of them didn't make it. Some of them lost family members because their treatments were interrupted when we terminated their benefits." Joe sank onto the couch, the full weight of Elizabeth's words hitting him like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't been an isolated case. She hadn't been a bureaucratic accident or an unfortunate oversight. She'd been part of a pattern. "You're telling me there are 17 families like mine?" "At least 17, Elizabeth's voice cracked. "The calls keep coming. My assistant has been documenting everything, and Joe. I think I was set up." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth took a shaky breath. "I've been going through internal communications from 2021, cross-referencing the termination decisions with board directives. The policy to cut contract employee benefits wasn't my initiative. It came from Harrison Blackwood and 2 other board members, presented to me as a cost optimization strategy that had already been approved." Joe felt his chest tighten. "But you signed off on it." "I did. I trusted their analysis. I believed their projections. And I've been destroying myself for 3 years thinking I was responsible for Sarah's death when ... double quote, she paused. "When I think I was being positioned as a scapegoat from the beginning." "Why would they do that?" "Because they needed someone to take responsibility if the policy ever came to light. Someone with a conscience who would blame themselves instead of investigating further. Someone who would implement increasingly expensive, guilt-driven policies to compensate, making them look fiscally irresponsible to shareholders." Joe stood up, pacing the small living room while Danny continued his homework in blissful ignorance. You're saying they used Sarah's death to control. You? I'm saying they used my guilt over Sarah's death to manipulate every decision I've made for 3 years. Every policy I've implemented to protect employees. Every safety net I've built. Every irrational choice they've criticized. It all traces back to what happened to your family. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The board's increasing criticism of Elizabeth's leadership. The pressure to resign. The timing of the settlement offer. Even the viral bus story. It had given them the perfect opportunity to frame her as emotionally unstable, making decisions based on guilt rather than business sense. Elizabeth, Joe said slowly, they're going to use this media attention to destroy you, aren't they? The board called an emergency meeting for tonight. They're saying the viral story and the settlement offer prove I'm emotionally compromised and unfit to lead. They want me gone before the other families start talking to reporters. Joe looked out the window at the news crews still camped outside his building. And they want me to look like I'm trying to profit from tragedy by accepting money from the woman I showed kindness to. It's perfect, isn't it? Elizabeth's laugh was bitter. We both look like we're either manipulating the situation or being manipulated by it. Meanwhile, the people actually responsible disappear into the background. Danny looked up from his homework. Dad, are you okay? You sound upset. Joe forced a smile for his son. I'm fine, buddy. Just talking to a friend about work stuff. Danny nodded and returned to his math, but Joe could see the worry in his son's eyes. 7-year-olds might not understand corporate conspiracies, but they recognized when their father's world was being shaken. Joe, Elizabeth's voice was urgent now. We can't let them win. Those 17 families, they deserve to know the truth. They deserve justice. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we control our own narrative. I'm suggesting we tell the real story before they can bury it under resignation letters and non-disclosure agreements. Joe thought about the reporters outside, about the money they'd offered, about the platform they represented. Maybe there was a way to turn the media attention from a burden into a weapon. The Channel 7 reporter, Joe said. Rebecca Chun, she already knows about the settlement. She's investigating. Can we trust her? Joe looked at Danny, still working on his homework in their little fort, and thought about all the other families out there who might be building forts of their own, trying to shelter their children from the consequences of corporate decisions made in boardrooms they'd never see. I think we have to, Joe said. Because if we don't tell this story, someone else will tell it for us. And I don't want Danny growing up thinking his father was too afraid to fight for what's right. Okay, Elizabeth said, her voice stronger. Now, but we do this together. We tell the whole truth, not just the parts that make us look good. Together, Joe agreed. What neither of them realized was that their decision to fight back would trigger a chain of events that would expose not just Nexus Industries practices, but an entire network of corporate policies designed to eliminate expensive employees across multiple companies throughout the region. The bus ride that had brought them together was about to become the catalyst for the largest corporate accountability investigation in Pinehurst's history. But first, they had to survive the night. Rebecca Chun had been a journalist for 12 years, but she'd never prepared for an interview quite like this one. At 9 p.m. Wednesday evening, she sat across from Joe Thompson and Elizabeth Campbell in the cramped living room of Joe's Ashford Heights apartment, her camera operator squeezed into the corner beside Danny's makeshift fort. The scene was intimate, almost claustrophobic, but Rebecca understood that some stories demanded this kind of proximity, the kind where you could see every micro-expression, every moment of pain or revelation crossing someone's face. Joe had insisted on doing the interview at home. If we're going to tell the truth, he'd said, it should be told in a place where truth lives. Elizabeth had arrived 20 minutes earlier, having walked through the gauntlet of other news crews outside, ignoring their shouted questions and camera flashes. She sat beside Joe on the worn couch, both of them holding steaming mugs of coffee, like anchors in a storm. "Before we begin," Rebecca said, checking her equipment one final time, "I want you both to understand that this interview will air tomorrow night, but clips will be available online immediately afterward. Once this goes live, there's no taking it back." Joe and Elizabeth exchanged a look, a moment of silent communication that spoke of shared purpose and mutual trust built over impossible circumstances. "We understand," Elizabeth said. "We're ready." Rebecca pressed record and leaned forward. "Let's start with Tuesday morning. Joe, tell me about the woman who sat beside you on the bus." "She looked exhausted," Joe said, his voice steady but soft, like someone who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. "I didn't know who she was. I just knew she needed a place to rest." "And Elizabeth, what was going through your mind when you realized who Joe was?" Elizabeth's hands tightened around her coffee mug. "Terror, absolute terror. Because I realized that the universe had put me face to face with the consequences of the worst decision I'd ever made, and this man, this good, kind man, had shown me compassion without knowing I was the person responsible for his family's tragedy." Rebecca nodded, then shifted into more dangerous territory. "Let's talk about what happened to Sarah Thompson." "Elizabeth, in your own words, explain the policy that led to her death." For the next 20 minutes, Elizabeth detailed the cost optimization strategy that had eliminated healthcare benefits for contract employees. She spoke about Harrison Blackwood's presentation to the board, about her own failure to investigate the human cost of the policy, about the 17 other families who had reached out since the story broke. "I was told this was a standard business practice," Elizabeth said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I was told that contract employees represented an acceptable loss in terms of overall company health. I was told that their healthcare needs were unsustainable given market conditions." "But you approved it," Rebecca pressed. "I did, and I've been trying to atone for that decision ever since. But what I've discovered in the last 24 hours is that I may have been manipulated into making it." Joe leaned forward. "Tell them about the board meeting tonight." Elizabeth took a breath. 3 hours ago, I was forced to resign from Nexus Industries. The board cited my emotional instability and poor judgment as evidenced by both the settlement offer to Joe's family and what they called my inappropriate public behavior regarding the bus incident. Rebecca's eyebrows shot up. "They're using your act of kindness toward Joe as evidence of instability?" "They're using everything," Joe said, anger creeping into his voice for the first time. "They're saying Elizabeth's guilt over what happened to Sarah has made her unfit to lead. They're saying the settlement offer was an admission of wrongdoing that puts the company at legal risk. They're even suggesting that this interview is proof we're somehow colluding for financial gain. But here's what they don't want people to know," Elizabeth said, pulling out a folder of documents. "I've spent the last 18 hours going through internal communications. The board members who pushed for the contract employee terminations, they've been implementing similar policies at other companies they're involved with." Rebecca leaned forward, journalist instincts fully engaged. "Are you saying this was part of a larger pattern?" "I'm saying Harrison Blackwood sits on 4 other boards in this region. Victoria Sterling sits on 3. Between them, they've been involved in healthcare benefit eliminations that have affected hundreds of families over the past 5 years. Joe's voice was quiet but firm. Sarah wasn't their only victim. The interview continued for another hour, with Elizabeth providing documentation and Joe sharing the human cost of corporate efficiency. When they finished, Rebecca knew she had something unprecedented, a story that connected individual tragedy to systemic abuse, wrapped in the powerful narrative of 2 people who'd found each other through impossible circumstances. "When will this air?" Joe asked as Rebecca packed up her equipment. "The full interview runs tomorrow at 11. But I'm posting a preview clip online tonight. Rebecca paused. Are you prepared for what comes next? Because once this goes viral, and it will go viral, your lives are going to change completely. Joe looked around his small apartment, at the fort where Danny was now sleeping peacefully, at Elizabeth, who had risked everything to tell the truth. They already have changed. The question is whether we're changing them for the better. Rebecca posted the 3-minute preview clip to Channel 7 social media accounts at 11:47 p.m. Within an hour, it had 10,000 views. By 2 a.m., it had reached 100,000. By dawn Thursday morning, #BusAngelTruth was trending nationally. The clip showed Elizabeth and Joe side by side on the couch, their faces illuminated by the warm light of Joe's living room lamps. The audio was crystal clear. Call on Rebecca, off camera. So you're saying that Nexus Industries deliberately targeted families like Joe's? Elizabeth, I'm saying that vulnerable employees were seen as expendable. And I'm saying that I was positioned to take the blame when the human costs became public. Joe, 17 families have come forward since Tuesday. 17 families who lost people they loved because healthcare became too expensive for corporate comfort. This isn't about me and Elizabeth finding each other on a bus. This is about a system that treats human lives like budget line items. Elizabeth, the board wanted me to resign quietly, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and disappear. But Joe taught me something about courage when he let me rest on his shoulder. Sometimes doing the right thing means staying put when it would be easier to run. The comment section exploded with responses. Other families began sharing their stories. Employees from other companies started questioning their own benefit eliminations. Investigative journalists from major news outlets began reaching out to Rebecca for source materials. By Thursday morning, Joe Thompson and Elizabeth Campbell had become the faces of a movement they'd never intended to start. The bus ride that had brought them together had transformed into something neither could have imagined, a national conversation about corporate accountability that would reshape how America thought about the relationship between business profits and human dignity. But they had no idea that the most powerful revelation was still to come. By Friday morning, Joe Thompson's phone had become unusable. The call started at 5:23 a.m. and didn't stop. Journalists from The Washington Post, 60 Minutes, and CNN, lawyers offering to represent the growing number of families coming forward, congressional staffers asking if Joe would be willing to testify before a House subcommittee on corporate accountability, a book agent who wanted to discuss movie rights. But it was the personal calls that broke Joe's heart and strengthened his resolve in equal measure. Mr. Thompson? This is Angela Rodriguez from Phoenix. I saw your interview, and my husband, Miguel, worked for Clearwater Industries. They cut his health benefits 2 weeks before his dialysis treatments were supposed to start. He died waiting for coverage approval. Joe, my name is David Kim, and I'm calling from Seattle. My daughter worked as a contract programmer for TechFlow Solutions. When she was diagnosed with diabetes, they terminated her position 3 days before her insurance would have kicked in. She's been rationing insulin ever since. Is this Joe Thompson? This is Father Michael from St. Catherine's in Denver. We've had 6 families in our parish lose loved ones after sudden benefit terminations from various companies. After seeing your story, they want to know if there's something they can do. Each call was a thread in a tapestry of corporate cruelty that stretched across industries and state lines. Joe sat at his kitchen table, Danny eating cereal beside him, writing down names and dates in stories that painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as business efficiency. Elizabeth had been fielding similar calls since dawn. Her phone rang as she stood in the empty corner office that had been hers for 3 years, packing the last of her personal belongings into cardboard boxes while security waited in the hallway. Elizabeth Campbell. Ms. Campbell, this is Dr. Sarah Martinez from the University of Pennsylvania's Business Ethics Program. I've been following your story, and I want you to know that you're not alone. We've been documenting cases like this across the country for the past 2 years. Elizabeth paused in her packing, a framed photo of a company charity event frozen in her hands. Cases like what? Coordinated healthcare benefit eliminations targeting employees with chronic conditions, family medical crises, or expensive treatment needs. The pattern is consistent across at least 40 companies in 12 states. Your board members' names appear on related documentation in 17 of those cases. Elizabeth sank into her former leather chair, for the last time. 40 companies? We've been trying to find someone with inside knowledge willing to speak publicly. Someone with access to board communications and policy documents. Ms. Campbell, you could be the key to exposing this entire network. By noon, Elizabeth was sitting in a conference room at the Pinehurst Community Center, no longer the CEO of anything, but finding herself at the center of something much more important. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as families gathered around folding tables, sharing stories and documentation that painted an increasingly clear picture of corporate conspiracy. Joe arrived with Danny in tow. The boys' school had become a circus of reporters, so Joe had decided a community meeting was actually the safer option. Danny immediately gravitated toward a corner where several other children played quietly while their parents discussed adult tragedies in measured tones. Rebecca Chun moved through the room with her camera operator, documenting not just the individual stories but the collective power of people who'd found each other through shared grief and growing determination. This is what they were afraid of, said Margaret Foster, a widow from Portland, whose husband had died after losing coverage during cancer treatment. They counted on us staying isolated, staying ashamed, staying quiet. Dr. Patricia Rowe, Sarah Thompson's former oncologist, had driven in from the medical district to add her voice to the growing chorus. I've been trying to sound the alarm about these practices for years, she told the assembled group. But individual doctors reporting isolated incidents don't get attention. This is different. This is different. Thomas Anderson, a labor attorney who'd been following corporate healthcare abuses, stood to address the room. What we're seeing here isn't just individual company policies. This appears to be a coordinated strategy designed to eliminate expensive employees while maintaining plausible deniability. The documentation Elizabeth has provided shows communication between board members at different companies, sharing best practices for what they call workforce optimization. Elizabeth stood, her voice carrying across the room. I want everyone to understand something. When I made the decision to cut contract employee benefits at Nexus, I believed I was making an isolated business choice. I thought I was balancing fiscal responsibility with human resources management. What I've learned this week is that I was participating in something much larger and much more deliberate. She pulled out a thick folder of documents. These are internal communications I retrieved before my resignation. Board members discussing which employees to target based on medical histories. Strategies for timing terminations to avoid legal liability. Guidelines for selecting executives who would be willing to take responsibility if the policies ever came to light. A murmur ran through the room. Joe stood beside Elizabeth, his hand finding her shoulder in a gesture of support that echoed their first meeting on the bus. Sarah wasn't just a casualty, Joe said, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying it. She was a target. My wife was identified as too expensive to keep, and they planned her elimination along with dozens of others. The room fell silent, except for the sound of children playing in the corner, a reminder of what was at stake in all these adult conversations about policies and profits. Stanley Green, Elizabeth's former assistant, appeared in the doorway of the conference room. He'd been quiet since Elizabeth's resignation, torn between loyalty to his former boss and fear for his own job security. Now he stepped forward with a manila envelope in his hands. I'm sorry to interrupt, Stanley said, but I thought you should see this immediately. He handed Elizabeth the envelope with hands that shook slightly. "This arrived at the office an hour ago. It's from the Department of Justice." Elizabeth opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the official letterhead and formal language. As she read, her face went pale, then flushed with something that looked like vindication mixed with disbelief. "What is it?" Joe asked. Elizabeth looked up at the room full of families, at Rebecca Chun's camera, at the documentation spread across folding tables like evidence in a trial that was finally going to happen. "It's a federal investigation notice," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Department of Justice is opening a formal investigation into coordinated healthcare benefit fraud across multiple corporations. They're requesting our cooperation as key witnesses." The room erupted in a mixture of cheers, tears, and the kind of deep exhales that come when people realize they've been holding their breath for years. Martin Reyes, the bus driver whose social media post had started everything, had been standing quietly in the back of the room. Now he stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen humanity at its best and worst during 15 years of driving city routes. "You know what this is?" Martin said, gesturing toward the families, the documents, the evidence of systematic corporate abuse. "This is what happens when good people stop being afraid to help each other. Joe showed kindness to a stranger on my bus. Elizabeth chose truth over comfortable lies. Now look what's possible." Rebecca Chun lowered her camera and spoke directly to the room. "The full investigation piece airs Sunday night on 60 Minutes. They want to feature your stories alongside the federal investigation. This is going national in a way that can't be ignored or buried." Joe looked around the room at faces that had been strangers a week ago and were now allies in a fight none of them had chosen, but all of them were determined to win. Danny waved at him from the children's corner, oblivious to the history being made around him but secure in the knowledge that his father was exactly where he needed to be. "So what happens now?" asked Angela Rodriguez, the widow from Phoenix. Elizabeth smiled, the first genuine smile Joe had seen from her since that morning on the bus. "Now we make sure this never happens to another family. We make sure Sarah Thompson and Miguel Rodriguez and all the others didn't die for someone else's profit margins." "Now," Joe added, thinking about the kindness his mother had taught him and the courage Sarah had always believed he possessed, "we show the world what justice looks like when ordinary people refuse to stay quiet." The avalanche of truth they'd started with a simple bus ride was about to reshape corporate America. But first, they had one more revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about how deep the conspiracy actually went. 6 months after an exhausted CEO fell asleep on a single father's shoulder, the courtroom in downtown Pinehurst was packed beyond capacity. Federal District Judge Maria Santos called for order as photographers and sketch artists captured what legal experts were already calling the most significant corporate accountability trial of the decade. In the defendant's section sat Harrison Blackwood, Victoria Sterling, and 9 other executives from companies across the Pacific Northwest, all facing charges of conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, racketeering, and what prosecutors termed systematic employee endangerment. Joe Thompson sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing the same navy suit he'd bought for Sarah's funeral, the only formal clothing he owned. Beside him, Elizabeth Campbell reviewed her testimony notes one final time, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to accomplish. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of federal investigators, congressional hearings, and media interviews that had transformed both their lives in ways they were still learning to navigate. Joe had been granted full whistleblower protection and was now working as a federal witness coordinator, helping other families navigate the legal process. Elizabeth had started a nonprofit organization called the Sarah Thompson Foundation, providing legal and financial support to families affected by corporate healthcare fraud. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Kim stood to deliver her opening statement, and the courtroom fell silent. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next 2 weeks you will hear evidence of a conspiracy so callous, so calculated, that it treated human lives as nothing more than budget line items to be eliminated when they became inconvenient. She gestured toward a wall-mounted screen where a complex, organizational chart showed connections between 12 companies across 6 states. The defendants didn't just make isolated business decisions. They coordinated a systematic campaign to identify and eliminate employees whose medical needs threatened quarterly profits. They shared strategies. They compared results. They celebrated when vulnerable people lost their healthcare coverage. Rachel clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of Sarah Thompson holding baby Danny in the hospital. Sarah Thompson was 31 years old when she died. A pediatric nurse, a loving mother, a woman who dedicated her life to caring for others. She died not because her cancer was untreatable, but because her treatment became too expensive for corporate comfort. The prosecutor's voice grew stronger as she continued. But Sarah's story is not unique. Over the past 6 years, the defendants' coordinated policies resulted in healthcare terminations that directly contributed to 47 deaths across 6 states. 47 families destroyed, 47 futures stolen, all to improve profit margins by a combined total of less than $8 million. Joe felt Elizabeth's hand find his as Rachel Kim's words painted the full scope of what they'd uncovered. $8 million. Sarah's life, along with 46 others, had been worth less than the cost of a single corporate retreat. The first witness called was Dr. Patricia Rowe, who testified about the pattern of treatment interruptions she'd observed over the past 5 years. Her voice remained clinical and professional as she described watching patients die from preventable causes, but her hands shook as she held the medical charts that told the story of systematic neglect. In my 30 years of practice, Dr. Rowe testified, I had never seen such a consistent pattern of coverage terminations timed to coincide with critical treatment phases. Patients would begin chemotherapy, radiation, or dialysis, and within weeks their employers would find reasons to eliminate their positions. Elizabeth was called to testify on the trial's 3rd day. She took the stand wearing a simple black dress, her former corporate power suits abandoned for clothing that didn't carry the weight of her previous life. As she was sworn in, she met Joe's eyes across the courtroom, drawing strength from his steady presence. Ms. Campbell, Attorney Kim began. In your own words, please describe how you discovered the coordinated nature of these healthcare eliminations. Elizabeth's voice was clear and strong. I spent 3 years believing I was personally responsible for Sarah Thompson's death. I implemented increasingly expensive employee protection policies at Nexus Industries because I thought my individual failure of judgment had caused a tragedy. What I discovered through federal investigators was that I had been deliberately positioned to take responsibility for policies I didn't originate. She pulled out a thick folder of documents. Board communications show that Harrison Blackwood and his associates identified executives like me, people with strong ethical foundations who would blame themselves for negative outcomes. They needed corporate leaders who would implement the harmful policies and then, when those policies came to light, would accept full responsibility rather than investigating further. The courtroom was silent as Elizabeth detailed the manipulation she'd endured, how her genuine guilt had been weaponized against her, how her attempts to atone had been used as evidence of her instability, how the very conscience that made her a target had ultimately led to the exposure of the entire conspiracy. The morning I fell asleep on Joe Thompson's shoulder, Elizabeth continued, I hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night for weeks. I was physically and emotionally destroyed by guilt over decisions I thought I'd made independently. Learning that Joe was Sarah's husband forced me to confront the truth. I'd been too manipulated to see. I wasn't the architect of this tragedy. I was its intended scapegoat. When Harrison Blackwood took the stand in his own defense, his testimony crumbled under cross-examination. Prosecutor Kim presented email communications, where he referred to expensive employees as budget drains and celebrated successful terminations as cleaning house. One particularly damaging email, sent to Victoria Sterling after Sarah Thompson's death, read, "EC taking full responsibility as expected. Timeline optimal for Q3 restructuring. EC, Elizabeth Campbell." They had planned her emotional destruction from the beginning. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. We find the defendant Harrison Blackwood guilty on all counts. We find the defendant Victoria Sterling guilty on all counts. One by one, the guilty verdicts rang through the courtroom like bells tolling for justice too long delayed. Joe felt tears streaming down his face as he thought about Sarah, about Danny, about all the families who would finally see accountability for their losses. Elizabeth was crying too, but her tears carried a different weight, the relief of someone who had carried undeserved guilt for years and was finally free to set it down. Judge Santos announced the sentences with the gravity befitting the crimes. Harrison Blackwood received 18 years in federal prison and $2.4 million in restitution. Victoria Sterling received 15 years and $1.8 million. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years, with combined restitution exceeding $47 million. But the real victory wasn't the prison terms or the financial penalties. It was the federal legislation passed 2 weeks after the verdicts, requiring mandatory reporting of health care, benefit terminations, and establishing criminal penalties for coordinated employee targeting. The Sarah Thompson Act, as it became known, would ensure that corporate executives could never again treat human lives as acceptable losses in their profit calculations. Outside the courthouse, Joe and Elizabeth stood together before a crowd of reporters and families who had traveled from across the country to witness justice finally served. Danny, now 8 years old and tall enough to see over the microphones, stood beside his father with the quiet pride of a boy who understood that his dad had helped change the world. "This isn't about revenge," Joe told the gathered crowd. "This is about ensuring that what happened to Sarah, to Miguel Rodriguez, to all 47 victims, can never happen to another family. This is about proving that corporate accountability isn't just possible, it's essential." Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority she'd once wielded in boardrooms but now used for a different kind of power. 6 months ago, I thought my career was ending in disgrace. What I learned is that sometimes you have to lose everything you thought mattered to find everything that actually does. Joe Thompson taught me that kindness isn't weakness, and that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid. As the crowd dispersed and the media packed up their equipment, Joe and Elizabeth found themselves alone on the courthouse steps where it had all led. The place where justice had finally been served for Sarah, for all the victims, for the system that had failed them. So what now? Elizabeth asked, echoing the question that had started their partnership in that Pinehurst Community Center 6 months earlier. Joe looked out at the city where they'd both been broken and rebuilt, where a simple bus ride had led to a revolution in corporate accountability. Now we make sure this changes everything. We make sure Sarah's death meant something. It already has, Elizabeth said softly. She brought us together. She made this possible. What neither of them realized yet was that their work together was just beginning, and that the foundation they'd built from grief and justice would become something beautiful, something lasting, something that would honor not just Sarah's memory but the power of two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and chosen to transform their trauma into hope. The bus ride that had started everything was about to become the beginning of something even more extraordinary. 2 years later, Joe Thompson stood at the front of a packed auditorium at Pinehurst University, looking out at an audience of business students, healthcare administrators, and corporate executives who had come to hear him speak about the intersection of ethics, and profit margins. He still felt uncomfortable with the attention, still preferred the honest work of numbers and analysis to the spotlight of public speaking. But some responsibilities chose you rather than the other way around, and Joe had learned that turning away from difficult conversations meant leaving space for the wrong voices to fill the silence. 2 years and 4 months ago, Joe began, his voice carrying easily across the lecture hall. I was just a single father trying to get my son to school and myself to work on time. I wasn't an activist or a whistleblower or someone who thought about corporate accountability. I was just a man who'd lost his wife and was doing his best to rebuild a life worth living. In the third row, Danny, now 10 years old and growing tall like his mother, had been sat beside Elizabeth Campbell, both of them listening to a story they'd heard dozens of times, but never tired of hearing Joe tell. The morning my life changed started like any other morning. Route 47 bus, 6 a.m. departure, same seat halfway back that Danny and I had claimed as our own. But that Tuesday, a stranger got on the bus who looked like she was carrying the weight of the world. Joe paused, meeting Elizabeth's eyes across the auditorium. Even now, 2 years later, he could still see traces of the exhausted, guilt-ridden woman who'd collapsed beside him that morning. But mostly he saw the person she'd become, the director of the Sarah Thompson Foundation, the architect of corporate accountability legislation in 6 states, the woman who'd chosen to transform her privilege into protection for others. I let her rest because that's what my mother taught me to do. That's what Sarah would have done. It wasn't heroic or calculated or designed to change the world. It was just human. The audience was silent, hanging on every word of a story that had become legend in business ethics courses across the country. What I learned, Joe continued, is that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is the simplest thing. Sometimes justice begins with a shoulder to lean on. Sometimes revolution starts with refusing to wake someone who finally feels safe enough to sleep. After the lecture, Joe and Elizabeth walked across the university campus where the Sarah Thompson Foundation had established its headquarters in a converted student center. The building bustled with activity lawyers providing free consultation to families facing healthcare terminations, researchers documenting corporate patterns of employee targeting, advocates training community organizers to recognize and report systematic abuses. Danny ran ahead of them, his backpack bouncing as he navigated the familiar hallways toward the Foundation's tutoring center where he spent his afternoons. At 10, he was beginning to understand that his family's tragedy had become part of something larger, something hopeful. He'd started telling people that his mom was the most famous person in business school, and that his dad was the guy who fixed mean companies. How many families this month? Joe asked as they walked past offices where Foundation staff worked with clients from across the country. 67 new cases, Elizabeth replied, checking her tablet. But here's the better number, only 12 terminations that fit the old patterns. The legislation is working, Joe. Companies are actually afraid to target vulnerable employees now. They stopped outside the main conference room where a support group was meeting, families who'd survived corporate healthcare fraud, sharing strategies for rebuilding their lives and helping others avoid similar devastation. Through the glass, Joe could see faces that had become familiar over the past 2 years, people who'd found community in shared trauma and shared determination to prevent others from suffering the same losses. Sometimes I wonder what Sarah would think of all this, Joe said quietly. Elizabeth smiled. I think she'd be proud that her death saved other families. I think she'd love that Danny gets to grow up knowing his father fights for people who can't fight for themselves. They continued to Elizabeth's office, where she kept 2 items on her otherwise minimalist desk, a framed photo of Sarah Thompson with baby Danny, and a small ceramic figurine of a bus that Martin Reyes had given her on the first anniversary of their meeting. Martin still drove Route 47, still watched over his passengers with the gentle attention of someone who understood that public transportation was often private sanctuary. He'd become something of a local celebrity after the story broke, but he wore his fame the same way Joe did, reluctantly, responsibly, and always in service of something larger than himself. "I got a call this morning," Elizabeth said, settling into her chair. "Senator Williams wants to introduce federal legislation based on our state model, the Sarah Thompson Federal Protection Act." Joe felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Sarah's name attached itself to new hopes, new possibilities for justice. "National?" "National," Elizabeth confirmed. "Mandatory reporting, criminal penalties for coordinated targeting, whistleblower protections for employees who report suspicious terminations. Everything we've been working toward." Joe sank into the chair across from her desk, the same chair where he'd sat for their first foundation planning meeting 18 months earlier. "Sometimes I can't believe this started because you fell asleep on my shoulder." "It didn't start there," Elizabeth said gently. "It started when you decided not to move away. It started when you chose kindness over convenience. Everything else just followed from that choice." Through the office window, Joe could see the city bus stop where Route 47 picked up university students and hospital workers, night shift employees and early commuters. The same kind of people who'd shared their morning rides for years. Ordinary humans navigating extraordinary challenges with quiet dignity. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Joe said. "I think about all the people who are riding buses right now, sitting next to strangers, having no idea that their lives might be about to change completely. All the small acts of kindness happening in anonymous moments that might ripple out into something bigger." Elizabeth nodded. "The ripple effect. That's what Danny calls it, right?" "Danny calls it the butterfly shoulder," Joe laughed. "He says that when you let someone rest, it's like butterfly wings flapping. You never know what storms might calm down somewhere else in the world." As afternoon shifted toward evening, the foundation building slowly emptied. Staff headed home to their own families, clients left with resources and hope they hadn't possessed that morning. Volunteers finished their shifts knowing they'd contributed to something meaningful. Joe picked up Danny from the tutoring center, where the boy had been helping younger children with their math homework. A 10-year-old already learning that teaching others was a form of service, that knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied. "Dad," Danny said as they walked toward the bus stop, "Mrs. Rodriguez said her husband is going to be okay now. His company can't fire him for being sick anymore." Joe squeezed his son's hand. Miguel Rodriguez Jr., whose father had been targeted for diabetic medication costs, would grow up in a world where corporate accountability wasn't just a hope, but a legal requirement. "That's right, buddy. That's why we do this work." "Because of Mom?" "Because of Mom," Joe confirmed. "And because everyone deserves to feel safe when they need help." They boarded Route 47 for the evening journey home, settling into seats that no longer felt like temporary refuge but like familiar comfort. Joe opened his evening newspaper, a habit he'd maintained from their earliest bus rides while Danny worked on homework, and hummed quietly to himself. Halfway through the ride, an elderly woman with a walking cane struggled to find a seat in the crowded bus. Without hesitation, Danny stood up and offered his place, helping her settle in with the same gentle attention his father had shown a stranger 2 years earlier. Joe watched his son with pride and recognition. Kindness, he realized, wasn't just inherited, it was taught through example, modeled through choices, passed down through small daily decisions to see others as worthy of care. As the bus wound through the neighborhoods that connected Ashford Heights to downtown Pinehurst, Joe thought about the speech he'd give tomorrow to another group of business leaders, the families he'd meet next week who needed foundation support, the ongoing work of ensuring that Sarah's death continued to save lives, but mostly he thought about the simple mathematics of human connection. How one moment of choosing compassion over convenience had created a cascade of accountability that protected thousands of families. How a shoulder offered in tired kindness had become a foundation strong enough to support an entire movement. The bus pulled into their stop as the sun set over Pinehurst, painting the sky in colors that Sarah would have loved. Joe and Danny walked home together, past the playgrounds where father and son had rebuilt their happiness one afternoon at a time, toward the apartment that no longer felt like a place they were just surviving, but like a home they were actively choosing. And somewhere across the city, in corporate boardrooms and family kitchens, hospital waiting rooms and community centers, the ripple effects of one Tuesday morning bus ride continued to spread proof that the smallest acts of human kindness could reshape the world when they were performed by people brave enough to stay still, stay present, and stay open to the possibility that strangers might be angels in disguise. The shoulder that had offered rest to a weary CEO had become a symbol of something much larger, the revolutionary power of ordinary people who refuse to let profit margins eclipse human dignity, who understand that true strength isn't found in self-protection, but in protecting others, and who believe that justice delayed is never justice denied when those with courage finally choose to act. Sarah Thompson's legacy lived on, not in tragedy, but in transformation. And every family that slept safely because corporations could no longer target the vulnerable was a testament to the truth that love, when channeled through action, really could change everything. 5 years after a tired CEO fell asleep on a single father's shoulder, Route 47 carried a new generation of passengers through the streets of Pinehurst. Martin Reyes, now nearing retirement, still drove the morning shift with the same gentle attention he'd always brought to his work. But these days, his bus carried different conversations. Passengers talked about the Thompson protections at their jobs, about healthcare benefits that couldn't be suddenly eliminated, about corporate policies that actually protected vulnerable employees rather than targeting them. Joe Thompson, now the foundation's executive director, still rode Route 47 to work most mornings. At 15, Danny had grown tall and thoughtful, choosing to volunteer at the foundation's weekend programs rather than spending all his time with friends. He'd inherited his mother's compassion and his father's steady determination, along with something uniquely his own, an unshakable belief that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things. Elizabeth Campbell had been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her work in corporate accountability reform. But her favorite recognition remained a hand-drawn card from a 7-year-old in Oregon whose father's job was protected by legislation that bore Sarah Thompson's name on quiet Tuesday mornings when the light hit the bus windows just right. Joe sometimes caught Elizabeth's reflection in the glass and remembered the exhausted woman who'd collapsed beside him 5 years earlier. The woman who'd trusted him enough to rest, who'd trusted him enough to tell the truth, who'd trusted him enough to change the world. Some shoulders, it turned out, were strong enough to carry more than just one person's weariness. Some shoulders could carry hope, justice, and the radical possibility that kindness, when it refused to remain quiet, could reshape everything. The revolution that began with a simple gesture of human decency had become the new standard for how business treated people. And somewhere, in boardrooms and family homes across the country, Sarah Thompson's legacy lived on, not in the tragedy of her death, but in the transformed lives of everyone her story had saved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.